Hi guys, and welcome to Cluster 1. Today we're looking at some feedback from the practice question we did, Whole Lotta Love by Goldbug. I'll play a section of the song so that you remember. All right, cool. So over the next few slides, we're looking at some feedback for your cluster. You guys know a lot about tone color, and that's a real strength of yours, which is great because it doesn't matter what question you're asked, you always need to know about the instruments and be able to identify them. You guys all identified that there were 3 separate sections, or if you didn't identify that, you implicitly made that obvious through the way that you had described the instruments. If you're someone who has not specifically said section 1, section 2, section 3, or section A, section B, section C, that's really important for you to make that clear, especially because this was a question about structure, but in more ways than that, when you have a question about any other concept, it helps to be able to visualize the piece as a whole and describe it. You all had things to say about the macro and micro structure, but you really need to focus on the micro stuff, and that's what we're looking at today. Some of the other things that you identified were about the other concepts, which was great because it helps to inform your understanding, but don't lose sight of the question. It was about structure and the use of pitch. So you've only got those 5 playings and not very much time to write. Focus all of your time making sure that you hit all your bases with pitch and then moving on. As I said, this was a HSC question, and these are some marker notes for what the best responses have shown. We're just going through them together now, and I'll highlight a couple of things that I think are really important. The first one, a clear understanding of both structure and pitch and an ability to link them to other concepts where relevant. I've already mentioned that use of tone color to identify sections. You guys in particular did a really good job of that. Clear understanding of what the question was asking. This is the bit where we really need to focus on making sure we hit all of our bases with pitch and thinking about those 3 things that are important in pitch: melody, accompaniment, and tonality. An ability to make clear observations. That is something that you guys don't particularly struggle with because you're able to identify things and speak about them clearly in saying that this was an isolated question we did, but when we have the HSC exam and we have 4 questions, by the 3rd and 4th question we start to get a little bit muddled in what we're talking about. So we need to think of some strategies to make sure that you're able to clear your head before we move on. An understanding of notation to enhance discussion points about structure and pitch. This is something we're focusing on today. Traditional and graphic notation. It doesn't matter which one you use. As you can see, the HSC markers are happy with anything as long as it informs your answer and helps to give a clear picture of your critical listening skills. An ability to elaborate on answers and give supporting evidence from the music. An ability to link points between sections. We're talking about that today. A clear writing style, either in prose or point form, without repeating information. This is something that our whole class needs to work on because quite often we cling on to the things that we think we know and don't think about expanding our understanding of anything. Ability to use unity, contrast, and balance as observational points in their discussion of structure and pitch, and an ability to synthesize their ideas and write answers while listening. This is one we'll talk about a bit later. An ability to look at the micro as well as the macro. Just take a minute to have a look at those points without me speaking so that you know what's going on and so that you can see this is some really clear specific feedback from the markers. What do we need more of as cluster 1? Well, in general, our macro structure is good, but our microstructure relating to all the concepts needs a little bit of work. The concept of structure is a bit of a tough one because, as we know, structure means the way that music is put together for the sections in a piece. However, it also extends to all the concepts and how those concepts are used to create the microstructure. So by that, I mean, how is duration or timing used to come up with the structure? A really clear example is bars. So how many bars are in each section? That clearly relates to both structure, but also to duration. The second one, an ability to notate and use notations to support your answers. There were some really fantastic examples of notation being used in some of your work, but we need to work on this as a whole. An ability to link points between sections and think about how instruments are used in each section and how they're changing. My classic example I've got here is the way that the role of the melody changes throughout the piece. If we have a listen to our piece again, in particular, the first bit and the second bit, so we're thinking about section A and section B, we'll have a think about where the melody is being displaced in both of those. Okay, so we just looked there at section 1 and section 2. You could see section 1, melody, female voice. Section 2, there was a bass riff and a synth counter melodies happening. And then we had a brass melody that was doing a repeated riff alternating with the synth. And it was a synth with a bit of a, electro sort of a sound there. So that's just one example of the way the role of the melody is changing from the female voice, then to these, and then to that as well. So we've got 4 different things that have a melodic role in that. Let's move on. Okay, so our focus for this particular feedback, we've talked about some things that we need to work on for next time, and we are looking now at how to notate things really clearly and how to make it part of your answer rather than just an add-on or something that you think will get extra marks. We are focusing on section 2, so we just listened to section 2. If we just write a couple of notes about section 2 so that we know what's happening. We have the accompaniment happening with drums, bass guitar. We have the synth. Then we have voice. She does a few little things in there, and then we've also got the melody, which is brass and synth. So we've sectioned that off there. What we are looking at is how to notate first the bass instrument. So I'll play it first and then we'll go back and see how we can notate it. All right, so that whole section that we listened to there, the bass does the same thing. It goes da-na-na-na-na. And even though you might sound like a crazy person singing in a HSC, it is going to help you be able to notate things, because if this is high and this is low, we are going Dun, 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 dun. Bass guitar riff. Now, if you wanted to go that one step further and think about what the interval between all of these things are, you could do that. Obviously, the widest part of this piece is this jump here, up to that one, but this, dun, 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 dun. So between here and here, if we were talking about range, that would be our range. But between these notes here, as we can see on a little diagram, it's a pretty small gap. And I would call this interval of a third. Okay? If you're not quite sure what that means, let's think about a C major scale. C, D, E, A, B, C. This is a C major scale, so if I choose the note C and the note F, and I don't forget to put my scale degree numbers in, the interval between this note C and this note F is a fourth. And the way that I came to that was because if we start with C as 1 and count up how many notes to the note that we have, which is F, that is a fourth. Obviously, this is quite easy to do because we're starting on C. So let's do another example where we use G as our starting note and we use B as our second note. So this is our first note and this is our second note. So in this case, G is our number 1. And if we count up 1, 2, 3, this interval here from G to B is called a third. So if you know how to play an instrument and you can play this scale and play the interval between G and B, that is an advantage. But if you don't and you are a singer and you listen to something like that bass riff, it becomes pretty apparent that the notes aren't too close together, like C and D. They're not too far apart, like C and C, for example, so it's somewhere in the middle there. Okay, let's move on and look at notating another section of this particular piece. Now that we've got the bass, and now that we have listened a couple of times, I'm sure that we're feeling a bit more familiar. I'll play it again and let's think about the things that are changing. So the roles of the instruments that don't stay the same. Typically, you'll find that the rhythm section, which is something like, the drums, bass, guitar and keyboard, they're generally the things that stay quite constant in a piece like this, and the other instruments are things that move around a bit and cause a bit of interest and something for us to talk about. So that is the first bit of section 2, because if there's, if we have two sections A and B, the first bit is the bit with the synth as the melody, and the next bit that's coming up is the bit with the brass as the melody. So that's a way to think about it in your head. The only thing that changed in that was the synth. So once we start to listen and unpack it a little bit and are aware that most of the instruments aren't going to be doing different things all the time, there's lots of riffs happening, we can focus on the things that are the ones that are changing the most, because they're the things that give us something to talk about once we've covered our bases with everything else. Let's move on and we'll think about that synth melody and see if we can notate some of the pitch in that. Okay, if we start talking about the synth instrument and focus just on one particular section, okay, because we're starting off small here, we don't need to, conquer the world today. We're thinking about section B, and remember before we said that there's one bit where the synth is melody, and then there's another bit where the brass is the melody. Okay, let's just focus on the synth melody for today, and it's that bit that we just listened to before. And I'm sure that most of you, when you listen to this particular melody in isolation and you really focus on it, it's pretty difficult to describe, and it's pretty difficult to be able to notate, even more difficult to notate, because there's so many different jazz, expressive things that are going on. So let's have a listen. Think about how you would put the description of this melody into a sentence. It hasn't started yet. Now. So the brass is about to start there. So I can tell you that the synth melody uses 4 bars to introduce the style of this piece. Let's listen again. Count the bars now. 2, 3, 4. So 4 bars. Let's listen again. See if we can just do a couple of little, preliminary draft notation drawings, saying we're using dashes and things like that. All right, so let's say it's something like that, and as we can see, it's quite messy, but the general gist of the way this melody moves is it goes something like that. So your options are either to try and draw something like this, do the little box and label it synth melody 4 bars at the beginning of section B. Okay, that's completely fine. To make it even more, explicit, you might want to then do another diagram of the brass melody that happens, and the brass melody we know goes dun 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 dun. That's pretty easy to do. Okay, I think something that will enhance this drawing here is being able to mention how fluid and how expressive and improvisational, if you like, the melody is. So we're moving on to the next slide in a moment, and instead of doing that pitch drawing, let's try and think of a sentence that would help us describe that. Please take a moment to read through the text on this slide. We are talking here about section 2, the bit that we've been talking about on the previous slide. section B or section 2, whatever you want to call it. The synth melody at the beginning of section B is 4 bars in duration and uses an improvisational style of pitch. That's just a fancy word for it's making its own thing up as it goes along. I'm sure that the musician knows what they're doing, but to us it sounds like, you know, they're just mucking around with the pitch, trying to make things sound really cool. I've mentioned the word jazz or blues because that's a typical feature of that style. So, you know, show the markers that you know things about other styles and you're able to use that knowledge to inform your answer of this. Back to this, the melody uses a large range and uses large leaps from lower to higher octaves. The notes used include 7th notes and other blues or jazz type melodies with a warbling effect used at the end of this 4 bars. Following this, the brass take over the melody with a repeated riff as shown. It's not shown yet, we're about to do it. So when we listen to it, we'll do that. Then the next bit, this riff is repeated 4 times, once per bar. We're talking about the brass riff here, before the synth comes in to take up the improvised melody again. This is a source of contrast in regard to pitch, as the synth is a complex melody and the brass is a simple one. You guys know that. It's quite obvious that the synth is really complex and all the other instruments are really simple, so why not make that, you know, make that division known to the marker and talk about how the musicians and the composer of this particular piece have probably done that to create interest, but also to create contrast and all those other things that we talk about, you know, tension, unity, variety, musical interest, whatever. So let's listen again and we'll get the riff, the repeated riff of the brass in this. And this is a much easier one to figure out. We actually did it on the last slide. Okay, so it's really easy, I remember it, so I'll do it in a minute, but you can see at the top there that I have done some little dashes, and if you're watching as this song went on, this is actually the bars of section B. As far as we listened, it does go a little bit further. This is where the synth is, and this is where the brass is. At this next bit, and continuing on, this is where the synth and brass do this thing together. Okay, take a moment to have a look at that. If there's anything that you're confused about or anything that you don't quite understand, then please come and ask me. Look, the whole point of me doing this thing up here, and I quite often do this when I'm trying to analyze a piece, is because I'm a visual person and I know that lots of you learn by seeing as well. It's really important to figure out the best ways that you learn. You know, with music, obviously it's something that we're listening to, and in our exam that's something that you have to do as well, just listen, but it can help to have something to see in your mind, and quite often I try and visualize what the instrument would look like as that person was playing it, or, you know, playing piano, I try and visualize what the keys would look like as well, or where the person will be playing on the piano, because that just helps make it a bit clearer so I don't feel like I'm, you know, shooting in the dark. Okay, cluster 1, we're up to the last slide of this little video, recap and future things to try. So the first one, notating easier riffs and repeated patterns is something that I really want all of you to try. Please make sure that you label them. As we could see, if you go back through this video or this presentation, the one where we tried to label the really difficult improvised jazz thing that Synth was doing, it was really tough to do, and, you know, it could be a bit of a hit or miss in terms of wasting some time to do that. So don't waste time on difficult patterns, just write a sentence about it and use the information from the other parts to help describe it. The other parts would hopefully be something easier that you can notate pretty quickly. We don't have hours to do a complete listening analysis of this piece. We've really only got 15 minutes from start to finish, and lots of brain power that's happening there. Get the structure right in your head. And make sure you have plenty of space in the margin of your page so that you can add and change things as you need to. So when I say in your head, it's whatever makes sense for you. So for me, it helps me to be able to do the little dashes and figure out, okay, this is where this is happening, and this bit here, you know, it's building up, whatever. Add and change things as necessary. In so many of your responses that I mark, everyone is sort of scribbling all over the page, which is great, but you often run out of room on either side, so just make sure you have some room there. And the last one, remember the rhythm section is of most contemporary music pieces is usually the bass, drums, keyboard, piano, guitar, and if you think of those things together while you spend mental energy on the melody instrument, you will be less confused and your brain will hurt less. This might sound like a bit of a silly comment, but I'm not sure if you're aware, but our memories can only hold 7 pieces of information in our short-term memory. So it's no secret that, sorry, not secret's not the right word, but it's no surprise that all of you feel like your brain's going to explode when we're talking about these pieces and when you're trying to do a HSC exam question, because there's a lot happening in there. So if you can try and think about instruments clumped together, for example, the rhythm section is all of these instruments, and I'm going to put that as one piece of my short-term memory and, you know, forget about that for this next 30 seconds and focus on the melody, then you'll have a lot more sort of energy and you'll have a lot more space in your mind to be able to really focus on the things that you need to describe at that particular point. Let's say, for example, it's the melody, and we'll hopefully come up with a clearer answer and something that makes a bit more sense. What we're trying to do here is show your critical listening, but also make sure that you're able to answer everything that's in the question without feeling like, you know, you've rambled about something completely unnecessary. Guys, as always, please come and ask me any questions that you have about this particular presentation. I hope you've enjoyed it, and let me know if there's anything in future that you feel like, yeah, you know, I know that and I need to work on something else a bit different so that I can personalize this a little bit for your cluster.